Доброго дня, вірніше вечора вже в більшості локацій, де ми знаходимося.
Good afternoon, because in most of our locations it is the afternoon now, and you are as well. I'm happy to welcome you here at the event that is called How Will the Energy Strikes Impact GDP and Exchange Rate in 2023? This is the event that is organized by the Center of Economic Strategy. I am the acting director of Center for Economic Strategy. The idea to conduct this meeting came about after 8 missile strikes of the Russian Federation that targeted Ukrainian energy infrastructure. Since we are analyzing the economic situation in Ukraine as well as economic policies that can potentially help to ensure the stable and sustainable economic growth, or at least limit the fall of Ukrainian economy, the issue that was absolutely clear to all of us was how will such turn of events impact the economic activity in our country, either this year and next year. An additional impetus to this conversation was the formal or the informal evaluation in the private sector, in particular Dragon Capital. They formally provided an updated prognosis where they have partially taken into account the negative impact of the shellings, as well as a range of other private companies have published their evaluations, and they have talked about the need to reconsider the forecast, which is why we decided to set up this event, which is one of the activities of the Center for Economic Strategies, as it allows to support the state finance management based on data we have. This event is organized with the UK support, with the support from the UK government, and it is delivered together with the company of Abt Britain. I would like to once again remind you something that is traditional for our events. The event is conducted with simultaneous translation. It is available to all of you from English into Ukrainian, vice versa. You can see the panel at the very bottom of your screen. If for some reason you will be forced to leave the conversation earlier, it is actually broadcasted to our Facebook page of the Center of Economic Strategy, so you'll be able to actually view our conversation. But I'm hoping that you will stay here until the very end. And you can also ask the questions in the Q&A tab or in the chat here on Zoom. It would be much better to do that through Q&A, as it is a lot easier to manage the questions for our panelists today. So the agenda for today is the following. We will have a presentation of a macroeconomics forecast, the updated macroeconomic forecast, which gave us a push to carry out this discussion. This is a macro forecast by Dragon Capital. It will be presented by Ms. Olena Bilan. She's the head of the analytical department of the investment company Dragon Capital, and she's also the member of the Oversight Council of the Center of Economic Strategy, which we are very grateful for to Ms. Olena, which is why we're very grateful for her support and her advice. Afterwards, we'll have a discussion. This is the type of agenda which is not very common, where we'll have a private sector representative represent their forecast, and then it will be later discussed by the government representatives. Because currently the only government-adjacent or official prognosis, the only government-adjacent forecast is the forecast which is included in the budget for 2023, which was developed by the Ministry of Economy. Because this is the prognosis that the budget is based off of by the Ministry of Finance, which is why today the participants of the discussion will be Denis Kudin, First Deputy Minister of Economy of Ukraine, Oleksiy Zhak, who is the General Director of the Directorate Directorate for Strategic Planning and European Integration of the Ministry of Finance. And later on, we'll have Sergiy Nikolaychuk, Deputy Governor of the National Bank of Ukraine, join us. National Bank also has their own national forecast. Those are the two official forecasts that we have. The National Bank forecast has not been updated yet after these missile strikes. But today, the head of the National Bank actually proclaimed the changes in policy, in monetary policy, and they also raised this issue during the discussions, so we can hear some updates from Sergiy. But now I would like to give the floor to Ms. Olena. Olena, please deliver your presentation. I saw the report, and I do have a couple of questions for the report, but let's start from how have you revised the forecast, and from what I understand, the forecast was done prior to the first blackout, so prior to the event that took place on November 25th, when for the very first time, and hopefully for the last time, Russians managed to divide Ukrainian energy network into separate pieces for 14 hours, which led to lengthy blackouts in most regions of Ukraine. So I hope you may add some opinion to the forecast, how potential strikes can influence Ukrainian economy. So I give the floor to you, Olena, and I give you the screen for presentation sharing. Thank you, Hlib. Thank you for the invitation. I would like to welcome all of you here today, and I really hope that Hlib will not be the only one having questions, because having questions means people are listening and people are interested in the topic. I'm going to show you a couple of slides regarding to the main macroeconomic indexes and forecasts. I'm going to share my screen right now. Yes, we can see everything. I'm just going to set up the slideshow in a minute. I apologize for the slight technical difficulty we are experiencing. Here it goes. Here on the slide, you can see the main macroeconomic indexes as we see them and as the government organizations see them, and the consensus of our prognosis. We usually follow Focus Economics as an organization because they are the organizations that gathers a few expert prognosis from both Ukrainian and foreign experts. And looking at this table, you can approximately see that for 2022, all of us perceive the situation in the very same way. The GDP fall, everybody believes will be down to negative 32%, and inflation will be 27%. And you see the National Bank has a 30% prognosis for inflation, but today they proclaimed that they're decreasing the inflation prognosis, and with the exchange rate, I don't really think there will be any changes in these couple weeks until the new year. We reviewed the forecast for this year. We worsened it by 2%. And it actually did happen due to the shellings of infrastructure, as we had expected the positive economic dynamics that we observed during the second and third quarter. We hoped that positive dynamics will remain for the fourth quarter, but that didn't happen. At the same time, we maintained the economic fall prognosis for next year at the 5% level, but there have been many changes done behind this number, and I'm going to show you on a graph. An important change that we made to the forecast is that our previous forecast was made back in July, And back then, based on the dynamics of the military situation, we believed that the war would take a while. It will be an exhaustion war. Now the scenario has changed positively, because what we are anticipating is the active combat phase of the war will stop sometime next year. We believe it will be somewhere in the third quarter of next year, and that after that, the blockade of the ports will end, and we'll see this primary post-war restoration of the economic indexes. We don't really believe there will be any large investments in that time, but we are only considering something that will naturally happen. Natural restoration of the economy due to the operation of ports, due to the occupation of Ukrainian territories, due to forced immigrants coming back. But at the same time, these positive signs are compensated by our forecast for a very difficult first quarter of next year caused by the heavy shellings of Ukrainian infrastructure. So unlike other organizations, we are quite pessimistic for the first quarter forecast. But I think that other organizations who provide economic forecasts will also review their forecasts later on. And I will be very happy if we will end up being mistaken and the situation will be better than we anticipate. So moving on towards specifics, I'm going to show you how the economy has been until today. I would like to remind you right away that currently we don't really have data from the State Statistics Service because they stopped publishing these indexes after the full-scale invasion of Russian Federation, which is why these indexes here, in regards to the GDP and different sectors, those are our estimates, because we don't really have official statistical data from the government right now. So what we are basing these estimates off of are surveys of private companies, different consumer levels, publicly available data in regards to restaurants, malls, that are published by specific associations of business owners, but I believe that is not the full picture. And we're also basing our estimate, comparing our estimate to the official estimate of the Ministry of Economics, which they are basing, and I believe the Deputy Minister will correct me, off of multiple factors. So here on the graph, you can see the changes in the GDP since the beginning of the war as compared to the pre-war level. So we are separating the real GDP and the GDP without the agriculture. Why we are separating agriculture is because harvest gathering is not rhythmical. It is dependent on the weather, which is not reflectant of what actually happens in the economy. So you can see the dotted line, which shows us what has happened with the economy overall, not considering the agricultural sector. You can see that there has been a slow increase in the economic factors, and then it has decreased after the first shelling of the critical infrastructure. We currently do not have any data on electricity consumption by businesses because those is classified data, but we know that since October, the economy, before October, the economy consumption has fallen by 30%, and we have lost certain production facilities due to the occupation of territories, due to the occupation of Zaporizhia nuclear power plant. The consumption of electricity has drastically decreased as well, and the network capabilities decreased, so that sort of matched. However, since October, due to these heavy shellings, the power generating facilities or the power transmitting facilities have decreased drastically because they have been destroyed. But the consumption rate remains the same and even increased due to the weather conditions. So the electricity production deficit in October was 10%, and in November it worsened to 15%. It is very difficult to evaluate what the deficit will be in the end of December, but we approximate it at 20%. So we are considering the decrease in the consumption of electricity at 45% in December. So as a result, that is a trajectory of the GDP that I draw by different quarters. Once again, I would like to tell you that we separate agriculture. So let's take a look at the dotted line. Here in the fourth quarter of 2022, that's where we are right now. And we can see that the economic activity is decreasing. And I believe that it will continue to decrease in the first quarter of next year. It will get worse because we'll have two very difficult winter months ahead of us, January and February, where we will face electricity deficit, greatest electricity deficit. But this situation is temporary. Starting with spring, with the second quarter of next year, the deficit of electricity will have to decrease because the consumption will decrease. We as regular people will decrease our consumption of electricity. And starting with third quarter, we actually anticipate a slow restoration of economy that will happen due to the end of the active phase of hostilities. The situation is drastically different from what we had hoped it would be. The gray line is our previous prognosis, our previous forecast. We believed it would be war of attrition, where nothing really happens. But the situation is quite different from what we had anticipated. It's a lot more dynamic. But in the very end, we can see that 5% of GDP decrease next year as we had expected it previously. The number remains the same. GDP trajectory looks in the following way. You can see it on the slide. I perceived 2013 as 100%, and 2014 was the first year of Russian aggression. And we can see how we had suffered significant losses caused by Russian aggression. Up to 40% of losses. We hope that the restoration will be very quick after the end of active phase of hostilities, but this is not something we are able to forecast on today because this is a long-term perspective. These are just our approximate estimates. I would like to say a few words about the exchange rate, because it's not something the National Bank provides prognosis for. They have a different prognosis they include in the budget, but I would like to give you a couple of my conclusions in regards to the exchange rate. As you all know, the foreign exchange market is relatively stable as compared to the difference between the official exchange and the actual exchange prior to the devaluation of hryvnia in July. Currently, the situation is a lot better. We can see positive tendencies. National Bank reserves are growing. There was a huge gap in reserves. in July, in June, July, the gap was up to $20 billion. So the reserves were up to $20 billion as compared to 28 prior to the beginning of the war. But currently, we had returned to the prior war levels of reserves, which means that the situation is becoming more stable. What is actually happening? The interbank foreign exchange market is facing a currency deficit, but the deficit is decreasing. The deficit is reflected with the black line, and the factors that influence the deficit the most are stated on the slide. The deficit is what the national bank spends, what the government spends. It's the national bank intervention to support the stable foreign exchange rate. And this deficit has decreased from $4 billion in June to $1.6 billion in November, which means that the situation is getting a lot better than it was prior to the previous devaluation of hryvnia. There are two reasons for that. We can see a decrease in the foreign trade deficit caused by the grain export and other agricultural products. And we can also see a decrease in the outpour of capital from the private sector. How the situation will develop? Honestly, it is very difficult to make forecasts for the foreign exchange market, but I take a conservative approach to this forecast. The shellings may potentially cause yet another wave of immigration, a temporary wave of immigration, which I take into account during my forecast. Refugees will definitely spend a lot more money abroad, which will mean an outpour of capital abroad. And also, the foreign trade balance will worsen because at the beginning of the year, we'll have to import gas to support the production of electricity. So according to my conservative estimates, potentially we can have yet another deficit up to $4 billion. But this is a conservative estimate. The situation looks a lot better right now, but it is very important to consider that this deficit will be compensated by international aid. The issue that we faced prior to the devaluation of hryvnia is that against the backdrop of the high deficit of foreign currency, there was also low amount of international aid, which is why the national bank reserves decreased so drastically. Currently, the situation is very different. Our international partners have the political will to support us. It's not always quick aid or quick assistance, but I believe that next year we can hope to receive more than $40 billion in international aid. This year, we had received $32 billion. So, even considering the potential worsening of the situation on the interbank level, where national bank will be forced to sell more foreign currency from reserves, I believe that there aren't really a lot of threats for the hryvnia exchange rate. I believe that the national bank will maintain the course of 36.6 as a healthy person's temperature all the way until the active combat phase is over. And a couple of words about inflation. I believe that all of you can observe this every day. The prices going up. Our indicator inflation is 27% today. We believe that it's very close to its peak, and the inflation will go down next year, but not significantly, down to 18% towards the end of next year. the reasons for that decrease of inflation is because most of the issues that had impacted inflation have reached their peak. The devaluation of hryvnia, the decrease in the oil and gas reserves. Of course, the events that had happened negatively impact inflation because production facilities have to spend even more money to purchase generators and to purchase fuel. So maybe inflation will be slightly higher than we are anticipating, but the trend for the decrease of inflation will definitely take place next year. And I would like to draw your attention to the fact that Ukraine's inflation indicator is not that high if we compare it to our neighboring countries. Our Baltic state neighbors have inflation over 20%, like Hungary. Other neighboring states have a smaller inflation index, but most nations are facing an inflation which is higher than 10%. What really helps us is that the prices for commodities have been frozen. The situation is very different with Ukraine. The prices for gas and water and heating are going up in other countries, but the National Bank has frozen those prices for Ukraine, which is we're managing to do today as well. So if that happens against the backdrop of everything else, I believe we'll have a positive dynamics of inflation. That is it on my side. I would be happy to answer any questions, listen to any other comments that other participants may have. Olena, thank you so much. You can remove your presentation. I actually have not really a question, but a request for clarification, and later on we'll move on to Dennis, Sergiy, and Oleksiy for them to make their comments.
А потім ми далі вже зможемо
обговорити
ті питання, які є в учасників, які є зараз в Zoom. І те, що я побачив в твоєму
And then we'll be able to answer the questions that were posed to us through Zoom. What I saw in your report and what actually interested me a lot was when we are talking about indexes, right? We're talking about GDP 30, 33, 35, the percentages for next year. We are talking about something that we always talk about during economic crisis, what actually causes all of these events. But in your report, you provided the analysis of the impact of occupation on these indexes. Because when we are talking about the changes of the real GDP, it is greatly impacted by which territories are under the control of the Ukrainian government and which territories are occupied. How significant is the damage to the formerly occupied territories? And how much additional value can these new liberated territories generate for Ukraine? If you can, please comment a little bit more on this question, because I believe specialists don't really pay a lot of attention to this issue, discussing economic factors in Ukraine. I believe that no one really pays a lot of attention to these factors because it's very difficult to evaluate. I have my personal estimates that the territory that was occupied at the very beginning of the war, it generated approximately 18% of GDP prior to the war, and then the northern territories were liberated. And now we have the southern territories and the eastern territories that are occupied, and they have generated 12% prior to the war. And since Kherson has been liberated, the occupied territories are the territories that used to generate 10% of GDP. So we're not talking about area, we're talking about the specific percentage of GDP that was generated by these territories prior to the occupation. And we don't really know what's happening at the occupied territories from the viewpoint of economic activities. We believe that their economic activity is close to zero based on what we see. Based on what we see with Kherson, with liberated parts of Kherson, based on what we see with liberated parts of Kharkiv Oblast. So my estimate is that the economic fall was not as great at the territories that are under the control of the Ukrainian government as the economic falls that happened in the occupied territories. Thank you, Olena. I would like to give the right of the first comment to Denis. As the Ministry of Economy provides the main economic forecast that is included in the budget, Denis, what could you tell us? How does the ministry evaluate the situation? What is the forecast for the impact of these missile strikes on the economic dynamics? Is there any, are there any plans to officially review the forecast and update the forecast by the ministry? If you do plan to update the forecast, when would you say that could happen? Are there any active policy measurements to be taken to decrease this impact? Hello, Hlib. Hello, dear colleagues. Thank you so much, Olena, for a professionally prepared document and its presentation. Overall, I can say that the numbers and the conclusions made by Dragon Capital are matching the trends that we have observed, that we have obtained through our analysis. As always, there are some small differences. Ms. Olena said that there was a negative 32% in 2022. We're providing negative 33.2%. We have worsened our forecast as a result of the attacks against energy infrastructure since November 23rd and since December 5th. Prior to these two dates, we also had negative 32%. The most drastic difference that we have are the opinions of where the economy will move next year. We are more optimistic for next year, and we are anticipating an increase of plus 3.2%. But knowing that the biggest risk for our macro forecast is the energy market, is the energy infrastructure. But just like all of 2022, Ukrainian economy is demonstrating miracles. Let's be honest with ourselves. In February, when the active phase of the war started, none of the people present here could not anticipate that the fall will be slightly over 30%. Ms. Olena is saying that this is what her forecast was. Maybe under the influence of ballistic missiles that were flying towards Kyiv, but we believe that there would be other scenarios that were more realistic back then. But honestly, the reality today is a lot better than my personal forecast and the forecast of most of my teams that we made back in February, March. And so I really hope that 2023 will exceed our expectations. Let's start by saying that making a forecast during the war is something senseless in essence. And maybe the prognosis as a product is senseless, but the process of analysis is very important because it helps us shape our view of the world. I cannot neither support nor deny Dragon's forecast, but I can just express a couple of opinions that I have. If I understand correctly, Ms. Olena, the main report that you have as of November 21st, it was done prior to these two missile strikes on November 23rd and December 5th. I have our estimates from November, and Hlib, you were completely correct. We collect data from 48 different sources. We have 48 different data sets. We can't really rely on the official data from the State Statistics Service, and I really hope that in the nearest future, Verkhovna Rada will bring them back. I don't really see the problem with businesses providing this information to the State Statistics Agency again. What's interesting is that our November prognosis has changed since the attacks. Our expectation was a negative 41%, which is much lower than we had forecasted before. As I had said, considering what I had said before, our expectation of the fall is a negative 33.2% at the end of the year. But the good news is that our consultations with the energy specialists are showing that the energy infrastructure had been restored up to the level of October of this year, which are great indicators. It turned out that our energy infrastructure specialists are very resilient. Based on the stocks that they have and based on the experience that they have, unfortunately, there have been little incidents, whereas the energy experts have been working round the clock to restore the energy supply, and the businesses have shown extreme resilience to these power outages as well. Considering that the amount of production has decreased, the amount of energy supply has decreased, the businesses are changing their business model. They are adapting to the power supply schedules that we have today. This is something that we did not expect. This is a trend we did not expect. We have conducted multiple surveys with large businesses, and we can see that they have adapted quite effectively, which is why the decrease of industrial production can be smaller than we could anticipate, considering the decrease of energy supply. If we're looking at next year, our forecast is very close to Ms. Olena's team. We anticipate that the active phase of warfare will end in summer, and then we'll move on to the restoration phase. We'll see peace in one way or another, which will provoke mass return of refugees and immigrants, which is why we actually expect an increase of internal demand, including the increased demand for the agricultural products. The peace will also mean the end of the seaport blockade, an increased amount of sea cargo transport. So the large businesses that survived will be able to quite quickly upscale their production and their business activities. Where our prognoses match up as well is the increased funding for the state budget from external sources, but we also have some differences in this area. If I understood your report correctly, you expect up to $42 billion. You said that this year it was 31-33? Right, so it was $31-33 billion this year. And next year you prognose $42 billion. We are more conservative in this regard. Why? Because over the course of this year, we saw a lot of promises being made, but we also know how to read actual numbers of foreign aid we received. And sometimes there's a huge gap between the promise publicly made and the time when the payment is made, the amount of payment made. So our conservative prognosis for next year, foreign aid is $20 billion, which will definitely influence public demand. Another difference that we have is the amount of production in the agricultural sector. We see that the areas with winter crops planted have decreased by almost 40%. And we can't really say whether other crops will be able to compensate for this decrease in the winter crop production. People in the agricultural sector are so used to growing crops on the land They are growing crops even despite active combat. So maybe if we were to make those decisions, maybe we wouldn't grow any crops this year. But the small companies, as well as large agricultural businesses, they believe in their land. And they believe that despite everything, they can still grow something. Which is why they had also showed extreme resilience. But we'll see what happens next year. Our prognosis is more conservative. And also, let us not forget the situation with the fertilizer market. We have a significant lack of fertilizers on the market, which will definitely impact the harvest next year. And the third thing is we are different in our evaluation of inflation and exchange rate. Towards the end of this year, our prognosis match, right, because it's almost the middle of December. But for next year, our prognosis, our forecasts are different. We are expecting foreign exchange rate corrections that will happen earlier. National Bank is very independent in their policy. Maybe Sergiy will tell you something else, but this is what we feel from the ministerial point of view. And in terms of inflation, it is obvious that not all of the damages suffered by businesses have been compensated for, which means that these damages will continue to impact prices. And more businesses will move on to generators, to using generators, which will provoke short-term inflation. I hope that this inflation will not be long-term, but it will definitely impact the situation. And of course, we understand that just like this year, despite the war, our inflation has been less impacted by monetary factors and more by imported factors. This import of inflation will continue next year. If we look at the prices for oil, they have decreased towards the end of the year, but the introduction of price caps, together with the complete limitation of oil sales that we expect in February, might provoke a deficit in oil and fuel. And then there's the conditions of deficit. There might be a significant increase in prices for fuel. The last thing I would like to highlight is the difference with evaluation for the employment market. This was a separate topic that we had discussed as a team. We were trying to understand what is the situation with the unemployment rate. Because different organizations were providing drastically different numbers. So we had to understand what was true. And what we understood was that today the population can be either unemployed or can not meet this criteria. In order to be unemployed, you have to actively seek employment, and you have to be able within 2 weeks start going to work on the territory that is under the control of the government of Ukraine. If the person is on the territory that is occupied temporarily, we perceive this person as not participating in the employment market. If the person has been forced to seek refuge abroad, we also believe that this individual is no longer on the employment market of Ukraine. Which is why those people are not technically unemployed, but they also do not fit within Ukrainian employment market. And so Ms. Olena is correct by saying that there is a group of individuals who had fallen out of the process of creating added value. So we believe that the unemployment is approximately at the rate of 16.5%, but we are only talking about all of the populations that is currently present on the territory that is controlled by the Ukrainian government, and about the people who are ready to start working in 2 weeks. So those are my comments. Thank you so much. Thank you, Dennis. That was very interesting. There are many numbers that I haven't heard before. I believe that it's worth discussing. But before giving the floor to Sergiy Nikolaychuk to hear a little bit more about his viewpoint of management of the National Bank, I would like to ask a question to Oleksiy Zhak, who represents the Ministry of Finance, because the most practical way of employing this forecast is to plan the state budget, to make forecasts for the budget income, for the budget expenditures. Oleksiy, how do you see the situation change? How do you see the situation impacting Ukraine's budget as a document? Or has the ministry started discussing the need to review budget maybe at the beginning of next year? And do you see, according to your own short-term indicators, the need to review the budget? Do you see the impact on the budget income, or maybe some other specifics related to the economic dynamics? Thank you so much for invitation, Hlib. In reality, first of all, I would like to draw your attention to the fact that we represent the government here. And so we definitely have our own forecasts, our own estimates. But the official prognosis is something that the Ministry of Economy provides. I'm here more on the expert capacity as the ministry, more than the Ministry of Finance capacity. But we had also made certain estimates with our team. And to answer your questions, I can share a little bit of what we had came to, the conclusions we came to, as well as my personal opinions. And to answer your question in regards to the impact on income, the short-term impact and the long-term impact, I consulted my colleagues in the Ministry of Finance, and they say that currently, in the short-term perspective, it is very difficult to evaluate the impact of this factor. It is almost impossible because income is impacted by a number of different factors. And the deadlines for people paying their income taxes for the fourth quarter will only, the deadline will only happen in April, which is when we'll be able to see the actual impact, but we will just see the overall change in numbers without being able to say what impacted that change, whether that was power outages or blackouts or logistic problems or supply chain issues. So maybe certain companies will be able to provide more clear data on how their plans, their production plans have changed because of the blackouts. But for us, from our strategic viewpoint, it's very difficult to evaluate based on the general numbers of income. As for the long-term impact, I have always said, and I will always say, that the Ministry of Finance is interested in the nominal GDP, because nominal GDP is the base for taxes. So not nominal GDP itself, but separate components of GDP. But without going in more detail, we'll just talk about nominal GDP. So we know that our colleagues from the Ministry of Economy are more interested in the real GDP. Our colleagues from the National Bank are more interested in inflation, but we are more interested in this. All of this is an amalgamation. But I would like to agree with the viewpoint of our colleagues from the Ministry of Economy, saying that economy is not showing linear dependence on the decrease in energy supply. So in reality, we have to take a look at different industries to understand how much energy every industry uses.
Проміжне споживання електроенергії, в яких перевищує 10% у структурі проміжного споживання, в структурі ВВП це лише біля 20%. Тут лише 1/5, скажімо так, нашого ВВП, воно
In reality, the industries that are heavily dependent on energy, the amount of those companies only constitutes to 20% of GDP, so only 1/5 of the GDP heavily depends on energy supply. And I definitely agree that our economy is showing miracles of resilience. Let's go back and remember the first COVID prognosis that we had, the first COVID forecast, and what we had in reality was very unexpected, positively. And the same here, we had very negative forecasts at the beginning of the war, and we are showing miraculous resilience now. So, of course, I think that the real GDP will be negatively impacted by these shellings and by the damage to the energy infrastructure. But I also believe that it will be partially compensated to the increase in prices. This is the adaptation of the economic subject, which is taking place through the use of generators, through night shifts that different companies are taking, and that is additional expenditures, of course. So I agree with you that just like this year, next year, inflation, there will be inflation of supply, but not inflation of demand. The story will continue in the way that Dennis mentioned. There will be a decreased supply of agricultural products due to the difficult situation with fertilizers and due to the decrease of crop growing territories. But against the backdrop of a decreased demand, we will have certain shortages, of course. And also there is another factor of transferring these expenditures related to the alternative energy supply levels. We'll see those factors transferring onto prices. So I share the opinion of our colleagues from the Ministry of Economy, because in saying that the prognosis that Ms. Olena presented in regards to inflation is more optimistic than we believe it will be. We believe that inflation will be higher next year. And as a result, the impact on the nominal GDP will be significant, but it will not be catastrophic. It's not catastrophic enough for us to review the budget today or make any changes to the budget. So, as Dennis said, it is more of a risk for us. If you take a look at our budgetary documentation in the chapter of fiscal risks, this is something that is described in the macroeconomic risk section. It is definitely a risk, but under the conditions of such uncertainty, where the damages to electrical infrastructure is only one of the factors that impacts the situation. It is definitely a significant factor, but only one of the factors that might impact the dynamics for next year. I think it would be reasonable to not rush, to take a look at the real consequences, to collect more data, more evaluation, more information on how the economy reacts to the situation, and only then make some decisions, because the budget is a very important, complex document that cannot be reviewed after every single missile strike. And in conclusion, in regards to the foreign exchange rate, for the Ministry of Finance, the foreign exchange rate is just a technical index. that we use for calculations. It's not a target index. And so the small devaluation that is included in the budget, that is taken into account in the budget, having the inflation of approximately 30% this year and then having a relatively high inflation next year, from a macroeconomic point of view, maintaining a stable exchange rate under these conditions is a positive factor. So as Mr. Dennis said, sure, there could be a small correction, but we believe that it is a factor that helps stabilize the economy. So we wouldn't perceive any significant exchange rate changes as a significant event. Thank you, Oleksiy. This is a very interesting opinion you have. And all the roads lead to Sergiy, to the National Bank, because this is one of the main points of the discussion during Olena's prognosis presentation is inflation prognosis. And my first reaction to these missile strikes was also thinking that everything will stop, we'll have a significant unemployment rate, we'll have a significant loss of income, but we can see that actually decreased the welfare of regular citizens, because we can see an increase of prices. For National Bank, inflation is the key index that they're looking at, as Oleksiy had said. So Sergiy, what is your vision? How are you planning to adapt your instruments?
Офіційному релізі та на прес-конференції керівництва Національного банку, власне,
there had been some statements made in the official release and during the statement by the National Bank, but let's just talk point by point through all of these statements to end this discussion on prices primarily, but I believe that you'll also touch on other things. The floor is yours. Good evening, dear colleagues. First and foremost, thank you for invitation and thank you for the ability to talk about such an important topic with all of you. We did have a meeting today of the Monetary Committee. We have an intermediate meeting of the Monetary Policy Committee where we did not discuss main macroeconomic prognosis, because the last prognosis we provided in October, the next economic forecast will be provided at the end of January. The meetings of the Monetary Committee are there for us to discuss the risks for our forecasts and the needed revisions for the forecasts. And of course, it is clear that the massive strikes against Ukrainian energy infrastructure, blackouts, is one of the factors that will have the key influence on us revising our forecasts. In January, however, we believe that the economic activity indexes, the GDP, will have to be reviewed more than the inflation. I'll talk a little bit more about GDP and then I'll move on to inflation. If we look at the dynamics of our forecast this year, in April, we believe that the GDP will fall by 1/3. So you can see that the forecast that we made at the beginning of the war ended up being quite true. We revised that prognosis based on the quick restoration of the economy in summer, after a number of regions were liberated. But at the same time, in October, when we were discussing macroeconomic prognosis, when we were approving a new forecast, a new prognosis, against the backdrop of the beginning of these massive shellings, this massive terror of Ukrainian energy infrastructure, we had worsened our prognosis to 33.5% of the GDP fall. This October prognosis actually envisaged temporarily lack of energy supply due to the destruction of generation facilities. But we also believe that the significant deficit would not happen. Events in November unfortunately showed us that we were way too optimistic. Especially the attack on November 23rd forced us to develop additional scenarios. And there are additional scenarios that are based on what will happen with the energy deficit in winter, in spring, and how it will reflect on the macroeconomic factors. I listened to Olena, I listened to Denise, and I believe that all of us are using approximately the same methodology to evaluate this issue. First and foremost, we are evaluating the approximate deficit of electricity that we will face as a result of these terrorist attacks, and then we're trying to map it out against certain types of economic activity and to understand what types of damages will suffer. There were a couple of scenarios that we had, but based on the efficiency of our air defense this week and based on the restoration rates of our energy infrastructure by our energy specialists, we are leaning towards the fact that the situation that we are seeing today will probably remain the same until the end of winter. So according to our estimates, the deficit of electricity will be at approximately 22.5%. It will be higher than in Olena's prognosis, as far as I understand, but in the second quarter of next year, when the demand for electricity will fall, we believe that the deficit will fall as well. But at the same time, I agree with Denise and Oleksiy's estimates. That is quite unlikely. Our methodology was based on evaluating the elasticity based on different industries. We believe that the flexibility for the industry will be at 50%. So we'll see that, for example, the 10% deficit of energy supply will cause a production decrease of 5%. And why that is because even large industries are very flexible. Some of them are switching to night shifts when the deficit of the electricity is not as high. Some businesses are using other means of electricity generation, like generators, etc. And some are trying to start using green energy. So as a result, we are expecting a GDP fall of 33% this year. I believe that this is a consensus we're facing right now. I don't think that the difference between 32.8 to 33.5, I don't think that's such a great difference considering the great uncertainty that we are facing. But for next year, we understand that the 4% growth that we anticipated in October is very unlikely. As of today, we are expecting that there will be a growth in GDP, but it will be quite insignificant. The final numbers will be provided in January, taking into consideration other factors. But as I had said, blackouts and the energy deficit will definitely impact our prognosis, just as well as other factors such as foreign aid, migration, Ukrainian manufacturing capabilities, etc. In regards to inflation,
відновлення наступного року ми, мабуть, знаходимося десь посередині будемо посередині між прогнозами Олени мінус 5% наступного року.
We will be somewhere in the middle between Olena's prognosis of minus 5%
по інфляції ми, мабуть, так само
and Ministers of Economy prognosis of plus 3%. That's with GDP, but with inflation, I believe that we're also somewhere in the middle of those two prognoses. It is absolutely clear that these blackouts and the deficit of electricity will definitely lead to an increase in prices. And there are two main factors at play. First of all, the increase in the price of the manufacturing, because the electricity made by generators is a lot more expensive, almost 2 times than the centralized electricity.
Відповідно, сплачують по тарифам для непобутових споживачів. Також ми розуміємо чудово, що деякі підприємства взагалі не зможуть виробляти.
We also understand quite clearly that there will be some businesses unable to produce anything under current conditions that will lead to deficit of certain products. And of course, the products that require heating are under the highest risk, such as meat, dairy, confectionery, etc., as well as the productions that require light, such as or heating, such as chickens or vegetable farming. It's also clear that the increase in the price of electricity will definitely impact the price of goods and services. But there will also be the counterbalancing effect, as we believe. The decrease of demand for certain goods and services as a result of blackout, and also people spending their money on generators, on mobile electricity stations, etc. This will definitely negatively balance consumer demand. So we're expecting to see the effect next year, in particular in the first and second quarter of next year, and then it will slowly decrease as the electricity generation facilities get restored. In October, we forecasted an inflation for the end of next year of 20.8%. We believe that the blackouts will add additional 1 or 2% to the inflation level for next year. So we don't really see any catastrophic consequences right now. There will definitely be additional negative effect, but it's also very important to take a look at the reaction of the businesses, the reaction of the government. We're talking about also a network of some grocery stores that would be open no matter the circumstances, and that would be able to prevent a chaotic demand on certain primary goods and increase in stocks. So, for example, basic necessities such as flour, because if we're talking about the production of bread, and also take into consideration the flexibility of Ukrainian businesses, we all clearly understand and we can clearly see that most businesses and the consumers are preparing for the worst. And we can see that based on the purchases of fuel by both businesses and the population.
На цьому я, мабуть, зупинюся. Можливо, якщо є якісь додаткові питання, буду радий.
I will stop my speech there. If you have any additional questions, I will be happy to answer those. Sergiy, I have a clarification, and then I'll give a floor to Olena as she raised her hand. It's a question that was brought up by Denis and then later more explicitly, more extensively by Oleksiy, was the question of real strengthening of hryvnia under these circumstances. And under the rapid growth of prices during the first 2 quarters of 2023, how does the National Bank see it? Thank you, Hlib. Thank you for drawing the attention to this question. It's a very important question to discuss. Denis said the factors that impacted the exchange rate this year, and he named imported inflation as one of the key factors. I honestly would disagree. I believe all the factors have an equal role because imported inflation has 2 factors in itself, is the increase of prices abroad and the foreign exchange rate factor. And the imported inflation is a combination of these 2. So the exchange rate that we have today is a lot higher than the exchange rate that we had at the beginning of the year. And of course, it did influence inflation, it did increase inflation. But I also believe that something that affects inflation this year even more are war-related factors, are the destruction of production facilities, the damage to the chain of supply, and this is something that was reflected in the food prices. For example, the tomatoes, the cucumbers that were produced in southern Ukraine prior to the beginning of the war, we lost a lot of the production facilities, a lot of the supplies this year, which is very clear to see on the graphs that Olena demonstrated. If in most of the other countries where we can also see an increase in inflation, the input of food-related inflation was approximately 25 to 30%. In Ukrainian inflation, the input of food-related inflation was more than 50%, I believe. And so, if we're talking about inflation next year as one of the important factors, it is important to consider the liberation of Ukrainian territories in southern Ukraine, which provide a significant percentage of Ukrainian fruit and vegetable supply, and also an improvement in the supply chains through the blockade of Black Sea ports. We believe that it will be quite a strong factor that will stabilize inflation next year. Do we need to attempt to change the actual exchange rate with a nominal devaluation? I doubt that, to be honest. I don't think we need to devaluate hryvnia in order to restore the capabilities of Ukrainian producers, because we know that exchange rate was not the problem for most Ukrainian producers and businesses. So talking about the foreign exchange rate policy, as of today, we can see that the exchange rate stability that we achieved using monetary means and using exchange rate stabilization means, it is paying off. And our exchange rate stability is much higher than we had it in summer. And as of today, I believe that we don't really need to correct the exchange rate right now, but we're also not ready to return to the free exchange rate, to the ungoverned exchange rate. But I believe that the situation might change later on? Thank you, Olena. I believe you had a comment. I'm just gonna make a really small comment right now. One of the factors that we taken into account was a very slow growth of the prices for resources like gas and water. We believe that there will be a 20% increase after the end of active hostilities, because we believe that the increase will be 20%, because any larger increase will definitely negatively impact the population. It's just a small comment that explains why we given the prognosis for the inflation that we given. Thank you, Olena. We have a lot of questions. I believe it is the most questions we ever had in the Q&A. I would ask all panelists to take a look at the questions in the Q&A, and I will select a couple of questions that are closest to our topic. Thank you, Denis, for one of the answers that you've given. So, colleagues, please look at the answered questions. There are quite interesting answers on there. But I will start with the questions that was provided to us at the registration. It is a very interesting question. It is about a single fact, but it's very important for our perception in the time of war. I believe that Olena will be the one to answer the question, but maybe our colleagues as well. What is the time frame of Ukraine's economy returning to 2021, to the level of 2021? Is it possible to expect, based on the scenarios that Olena and Lena's team is following for 2024? I don't really remember. There weren't really prognoses from the Ministry of Economy after 2023, but maybe you had the vision as well. Or maybe some of the politicians asked you this question. Sergiy, maybe you had to answer this question as well. What is your vision? When will the Ukrainian economy return towards the level that it had prior to the full-scale invasion? The question is very difficult. Honestly, I don't really have an answer for that today. Because I personally haven't really evaluated the potential impact of the restoration of the economy. This future is growing ever closer, and I believe that we'll get to it eventually, but we don't really have any forecast today. The damages that have been done so far, I believe we will not be able to restore those damages on our own. Potentially, we will be able to rebuild with foreign assistance, but it's very difficult to estimate the rates, the amounts of foreign assistance today. And yet, another factor will be whether we will receive any reparations from the central bank reserves of Russian Federation, for which the process had started already. But honestly, believe that without any external assistance, it will be impossible to fund the restoration. The need for restoration is $600 billion, and it is 3 times that our peak GDP. My short answer is I don't have any answers right now, because there's so many factors to consider. Your 2024 forecast was that we will be much lower than we were in 2021, right? Yes. In 2024, we will see the first foreign aid for the restoration of economy, and so I believe that the GDP will grow drastically, considering that it will not be limited by the damaged energy production facilities, provided that we'll get the Zaporizhzhia nuclear plant back under Ukrainian control, provided that the energy infrastructure will be relatively intact. I think that 2024 will be a year of two-digit growth, but it doesn't really mean anything. After falling by 37% over the course of 2 years, which is anticipated for this year and next year, even a 15% growth wouldn't really mean anything. It wouldn't bring us back to the pre-war level. It would take another couple of years. These questions that we are asking ourselves, it's not the politicians that are asking us this. It is clear that it's one of the crucial questions after the post-war restoration. Because generally speaking, if we look at these short-term estimates, I don't even want to tell you the answer. We know that there is a 70 rule, where you take the growth percentage, and then there's 70. In the bottom, you divide 70 by the percentage of the growth, and you get a number of years in which your economy will grow twice. So there's also a factor of which GDP we're talking about. I believe it's important to talk about the dollar-based GDP. So when will we come back to the GDP of $200 billion? And there's so many buts in this discussion. Narrowly speaking, that means we'd had to have a 60% increase of GDP. With a 7% growth, we'll need 7 years approximately. So it might be 2030 when we reach the pre-war levels of GDP. It might happen a lot faster. It might never happen. It might happen long term. If the scenario comes true according to which in the middle of next year the active phase of hostilities ceases, we reach peace, and then next year we return to restoration, I believe we can have an ambitious goal of returning to the pre-war levels of GDP after 3 years. But this is a very difficult task to accomplish. And there are two factors here: capital and work. The first is the amount of direct capital investments that will be used by Ukrainian companies, because we remember that investments that will be used by foreign companies was foreign building materials. They will have no impact on our GDP. And the second factor is the active migration policy, because depending on how quickly we restore our internal demand, and depending on how quickly we bring in the productive workforce back into our economy, that will impact the result. And the third is the opening of the markets. Because the only way to fill the gap in the internal demand is only through export. Thank you. The question to Denis and Sergiy, it has been asked in the Q&A in different variations. Coming back to the question of energy strikes, what state policy measurements both the government and the National Bank are taking in order to minimize the effects of these strikes on the economic activities? Denis, maybe you would like to continue? Because you obviously worked with this issue. I would offer Sergiy to start, and then I'll build off of that. All right. Let me start by saying what we are doing today. Under the conditions of the strikes that target critical infrastructure, and under the conditions of an energy deficit, we are currently focusing our attention on ensuring the stable operation of bank systems. We had the same goal in the first few months of war, when the high level of digitalization of our banking system really helped us accomplish this task. And after the first 2 weeks, the demand for cash stabilized. The population and businesses realized that the banking system works, it is operational no matter the nightmares that is happening, and people continue to use their cards. Currently, the situation is slightly different because this high level of digitalization of the banking system it might slightly backfire. It is an additional risk factor under the conditions when the banks will be unable to make those payments digitally. We paid a lot of attention to discussing this issue. You might have heard about the Project Power Banking or the resilience network of the banking system that the National Bank has launched since the beginning of all these electricity supply shortages. First was the state-owned banks, and later on was other banks, which is where we made sure that the banking system will work even under the worst power outages, the worst blackouts. When there will be no electricity for up to a week. Ukrainian banks, upon our request, have made drastic steps, unprecedented steps. They have introduced banking roaming, where they had removed fees for withdrawing cash from other banks from their ATMs. The banks are providing access of the employees of other banks to their offices. So we can see the consolidation of efforts from the banking community. The competition between banks is no longer as relevant. The survival of the banking system as such is a lot more relevant because everybody understands that we are all in the same boat today. That's the first thing I would like to highlight. The second issue here is something that I had started to comment on, is that under the circumstances of blackout and energy deficit, there are certain production facilities that are suffering most. And we had actively discussed this with our colleagues from the Ministry of Finance and Ministry of Economics. How do we support the production and the sale of the socially significant products even under an increased inflation? And we're talking about creating a network of grocery stores where the population would be able to pay for groceries with their cards. We're also talking about the increasing our stockpiles of critical commodities such as flour. We can do that by increasing the production in the flour mills and including flour mills in the list of critical infrastructure that has to be supplied with electricity even during blackouts. So we want to make sure that there is no deficit of bread. And we were also talking about an increase of support to the manufacturers of critical products, socially significant products, through those 4 grant programs led by the Ministry of Economics, and also by expanding and adapting the program of 579 according to the needs of food industry and according to the requirements of the critical production facilities.
Сергію, Денисе, одне коротке питання, і після цього буде лише одне маленьке питання, і будемо закінчувати вже, бо виходимо за графік.
Sergiy, Denis, I have a very short question, and then I'll have another brief question that will be the end, because we are running behind schedule.
Чи розглядали ви це питання, тому що, з одного боку...
So, crediting the purchase of generators, have you reviewed this question?
Пропозиції зберігатися.
Because on one hand, it allows to preserve part of the supply, percentage of supply, because it allows small businesses to continue functioning even if they are unable to purchase generators. But it also allows to not increase the prices right away. Have you had any of the discussions? Because we have the government representatives present here and we have national bank representatives. Would you think this is a necessary measure? I'm ready to start here. Abt Bank has introduced a number of projects to lend money to credit the purchase of generators for manufacturers, for industrial producers, and for private consumers, for private households. Hlib, I'm going to provide you numbers that you haven't heard before. Over the course of the last 2 weeks, today, the second largest import in Ukraine are generators after fuel. This is insane. Over the course of 2 weeks, we had imported generators worth of $60 million. From our conversations with the companies, the amounts of generators that are on their way, that are supposed to arrive towards the end of December, February, and March, those numbers are greater than we've ever heard. It seems as if the entire country is going completely autonomous with their electricity supply. In every house, every business, every household, Russia is forcing us to becoming so strong, to becoming invincible and indestructible, and this is what will happen. We believe that the military challenges are what they are. Since the beginning of summer, it was clear that the enemy will target our energy infrastructure, and a large number of companies have started to prepare for this in June, July, and August, which is why today, according to our estimates, at least 20% of critical grocery stores, 15% of banks are already supplied with generators. It is clear that later on this number will only grow, but even this number will allow us to survive short-term outages. And also, in large cities, we can see private households purchasing generators. I hope that the number of banking projects that will fund this will increase. Lviv and Kyiv are 2 cities that have declared municipal.
Lviv і Київ компенсують 75% вартості обладнання. Тобто ОСББ ставить генератор на будинок, а міська влада компенсує 3/4. Прекрасні програми. Думаю, що і наші партнери іноземні будуть готові на це давати гранти. Тут головне обмеження – це швидкість.
And I believe that our partners will also be willing to fund this. But the main limitation here is this delivery speed, because we need those generators today. Thank you so much, Denis. Thank you, Sergiy. Oleksiy, do you have any additional comments? Because the question that I wanted to ask, Denis has already answered in the Q&A section. So I think that we have covered the main questions. Are there any comments or any corrections that you would have, Oleksiy, or maybe you would like to draw the attention to something that has already been discussed?
все вичерпно розповіли.
Чудово. Тоді всім дуже дякую. Дуже дякую тим, хто слухав сьогодні. Ми так досить швидко організовували цю подію протягом буквально тижня, так само, як і події розгортаються. Я думаю, що ми далі ще будемо протягом найближчих місяців аналізувати вплив і, власне, відповіді з боку державної політики на цей виклик, тому що дійсно воно дуже сильно змінює і секторальну структуру, і навіть коли починаєш...
Because it definitely changes both the sector-based structure of the economy, and on one hand, this massive purchasing of generators is positive, but on the other hand, what will be the consumption of fuel? What will we do with these generators? Of course, this resilience is very good on one hand, but of course, we will definitely pay a price, and we will definitely analyze that price over the course of the next couple of months. But overall, as I believe, the picture that we saw based on today's discussion is more optimistic than it seems. Before hearing all of these professional opinions from Oleksiy, Denis, Sergiy, and Olena, thank you all very much. Have a good and peaceful evening, and we will see you at our next event. I believe that this year, even though it's just a couple of weeks until the end of the year, I believe that CES will conduct yet another public event. So let's stay in touch. I wish all of us great victory, because it turns out this year we're very lucky. My last joyful remark, why do we have to win no later than 2023 for all of these prognoses to come back? We're also very lucky this year. January 1st is Sunday. So if we do not win in 2023, we'll have to go to work on the 1st of January 2024, which will be a significant challenge. So let's win by then. Thank you all so much. Have a great evening, everybody, and have a peaceful workday tomorrow.